Rome knew its seasons well. Spring for festivals, summer for wars, autumn for gathering the harvest. But that winter resembled no other. A harsh cold crept down from the north, closing roads, freezing rivers, and keeping armies in their tents waiting for warmth. In the markets, bread became more precious than gold, and in the palaces, torches died out one after another, as if the city that had ruled the world was slowly losing its heat. It was a long winter, the winter that chilled the empire. Night fell over Rome slowly, not as it usually did after a day filled with noise, carts, and merchants, but like a heavy shadow crawling over walls that knew warmth would not return soon. The few fires burning in the squares flickered under cold northern winds, and people gathered around them, stretching out trembling hands, while their eyes followed the sparks, as if watching the last stars of winter. The city that had once been the center of the world felt its heartbeats slowing. Streets once filled with guards' whistles and horses' hooves were now silent. In the markets, traders hid what little grain they had left. In homes, old hearths were lit again, demanding wood that no one could find. Even the Tiber, the river of life, lost its voice, running faintly like the breath of a sickbed heard by no one. Famine began to show its head in dark corners, and cold slipped through cracks into people's chests. No one spoke anymore of glory or empire, only of a warm day and a loaf to be shared among neighbors. In a distant palace on the hill, a scribe wrote by the weak light of a candle, "Even mighty Rome fears the winter." The sentence summed up an entire age, an age in which warmth left the empire as birds leave their nests with the first storm. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the moon slipped between them, lighting the statues of the emperors whose shine had faded. They seemed to look with confusion at a city that no longer knew itself. Rome, which had built the world out of stone, now sat shivering upon its own stones. It was only the first chapter, the first sign of the long cold, the age later known as the Empire's last winter. Far to the north, winter tightened its grip over a mighty river called the Rhine. For centuries, the river had marked the boundary between two worlds: Rome, with its order, army, and laws, and beyond it, the forest peoples of snow and shadow, the Vandals and others whom the Romans called barbarians. On a late December evening in the year 406, the cold struck so deep that some believed the river slept beneath a blanket of ice. Some Roman writers claimed it froze solid, allowing entire tribes, men, women, children, and animals, to cross on foot. Others said they found abandoned crossings and guards who had withdrawn after months of hunger and frost. Whatever the truth, that night became a turning point. Whole hosts left their lands beyond the Rhine seeking warmth and food at the heart of the empire itself. By morning, the river was no longer a boundary. It had become a bridge into chaos. Gaul, what is now France and Belgium, woke to sounds it had never heard. Walls collapsed, roads filled with fleeing carts, monasteries hid grain from hungry eyes. In Mainz, one of the first cities on the Rhine, fires were said to have swept through the markets, and bells rang all night until dawn. The news reached distant Rome weeks later, but its echo was colder than snow. A northern gate had fallen, and no one knew if it would ever close again. Emperor Honorius, then in Ravenna, a fortified city between marshes and sea looked upon a map that had lost half its colors. The roads that once sent grain and soldiers from the north were now at the mercy of tribes moving without pause. The winter that froze the river melted the last confidence in the empire's borders. From that night on, the Roman world began to crack quietly, like an ice sheet under the feet of those crossing it. Rome still basked in southern light, but the cold that began at the Rhine moved toward it with slow certainty. For centuries, Rome's strength came not just from swords, but from bread that fed millions in an empire spread across 3 continents. Grain supply, or annona, was both a political and sacred economic system. Roman Africa, today's Tunisia, and eastern Algeria, was the empire's wheat basket. Ships left Carthage and Sfax carrying thousands of tons of grain to the port of Ostia, and from there smaller boats carried it upriver into Rome itself. Every year, millions of loaves were distributed for free as part of the policy of panem et circenses, bread and entertainment. Even Sicily, that fertile island south of Italy, sent grain, oil, and wine. Officials recorded every shipment with precise notations on wooden tablets, beating like the empire's pulse. But the winds changed. In 439, the Vandals captured Carthage, the most important African port and Rome's greatest granary. A vital artery was severed. Ships no longer arrived as before. Sicily alone could not feed Rome. Markets swelled with anxiety. Prices rose, and bread that had once been free was sold at many times its value. Some years supplies didn't last until spring, and people awaited ships the way they awaited rain. And it wasn't just wheat. Mills went silent. Bakers vanished seeking work elsewhere. Officials wrote long reports about shortages, but no one could control the sea or reclaim lost Africa. At Portus, the newer port built in the 1st century to expand trade, ships moaned under the wind as if aware their voyages would never be the same. The river that once carried grain daily now saw boats returning empty or with bad news. Hunger seeped into the capital, not as a sudden storm, but like a slow-moving elephant. Losing Africa was not merely losing land, it was losing warmth, rhythm, and life. Rome discovered something it had never known. Hunger could defeat swords, and bread, more than iron, kept cities alive. But bread needed clear skies and calm waters. Not all of Rome's cold came from war or wind. In the mid-6th century, something happened that dimmed the very sky. In 536, the Byzantine historian Procopius wrote, "The sun did not shine as usual, but gave a dim light like the moon. The day looked like an endless sunset." What no one knew then was that the world was experiencing a rare and devastating natural event. Massive volcanic eruptions. Perhaps in the northern hemisphere or Central America. Sent ash into the atmosphere, spreading a gray veil that blocked sunlight. The earth cooled suddenly, crops failed, and a long era of climatic mystery began. Today, scholars call it the onset of the late antique Little Ice Age, lasting about a century from 536 onward. More eruptions followed in 540 and likely 547, deepening the darkness and cold. These years left traces not only in ancient writings, but in tree rings and Greenland's ice layers, where scientists can still read sulfur and ash as if reading a page from a frozen book. Across Europe and the East, drought hit fields, spring came late, and fruits fell before ripening. In small Italian villages, farmers looked up at a gray sky and said the sun was sick. In Constantinople, people spoke of a strange cold light, and a sea turned dark like lead. Temperatures fell. Rivers froze in lands that had never seen ice, and snow buried fields until livestock died. This was no ordinary winter. It marked the beginning of a new era, long and shadowed. Agriculture, trade, and roads shrank. The road from farm to market became a journey through mud and snow. Bread grew scarce even in seasons once rich. Nature intertwined with history so tightly that it became unclear which was stronger, the earth's anger or human weakness. Under this pale light, Rome and the world around it entered a new winter. Longer than seasons, deeper than frost. And if summer froze, how could autumn hope to stay warm? In ancient times, wars weren't fought year-round. Armies had seasons just as farmers did. When winter came, swords fell silent, tents shrank, and the dust of war wagons settled. Roman generals knew winter was an unbeatable foe. The famed Roman roads turned to mud in rain, wagons sank to their axles, soldiers stumbled through sludge. Supplies were the greatest challenge. Food spoiled in cold and damp, beasts of burden weakened and died, and even fire, soldiers' closest companion, refused to burn in wet tents. During these harsh months, armies returned to fortresses, to winter. Repairing weapons, tending to the wounded, counting supplies for the next spring. The Roman military writer Vegetius wrote, "War requires time and patience. He who desires victory in summer must prepare for it in winter." Thus, winter was a season of military silence. Yet it was not peace. Silence hid exhaustion, hunger, and fear. A commander knew his army might weaken long before the enemy arrived. Even messages were delayed. Couriers couldn't cross snow-covered mountains, and supply caravans were trapped until the thaw. Border cities like Dara in the east or Arles in the west relied on massive grain stores filled in autumn. Over centuries, stopping war in winter became a European military custom and a natural law. But in Rome's final winter, those blocked roads and idle armies became an image of a frozen world waiting for warmth to rewrite history. Winter descended upon Rome not as a passing season, but as a silent enemy wrapping itself around the walls. Outside, the Gothic armies led by King Vitiges encircled the city. Inside, the Byzantine commander Belisarius struggled to keep the old capital alive. This happened in 537 to 538 during the Gothic War between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Gothic Kingdom of Italy. Rome, as in many of its crises, was more symbol than functioning city. Yet even symbols need water and bread to survive. The Goths' first act was to cut the aqueducts, the arteries that had supplied Rome with water for centuries. Water vanished from homes, baths, gardens, fountains dried. Even soldiers on the walls drank brackish well water or collected rain. Hunger followed. Grain stores were nearly empty. Supplies sent from the east were few and often threatened. Belisarius had only one option: to use the Tiber itself to grind wheat. Army engineers built floating mills powered by the river, with the millstones turning upon anchored boats. An eerie sight of mills spinning quietly amid the cold while fighting raged on the banks. Weeks passed. Bread was rationed by weight and number. Ovens opened only for limited hours. At night, doors were bolted against theft, and people lit their homes with tiny drops of oil, trying to warm their spirits more than their hands. Cold wasn't the only danger. Fear was. Fear of the walls falling, grain running out, or corpses piling up after burials ceased. The siege lasted nearly a year. Civilians and soldiers together fought hunger and isolation until the Goths finally withdrew, leaving behind a changed city. Thousands dead, neighborhoods emptied. Belisarius won a military victory, but Rome did not defeat its winter. Fires were insufficient, prayers were insufficient, and old glory could not warm stone. The siege was more than a battle. It was a lesson in the fragility of civilization before the cold. When battle quieted, fear remained. It merely changed shape. Now fear was daily hunger. In Gothic Italy, officials sought to restore order, not by fighting wars, but by writing letters in cold offices, attempting to manage grain, taxes, and supplies. Among the voices of that weary age was Cassiodorus, a scholar and minister to the Gothic kings. His letters, later collected in a book called Variae, echo that exhausted time. In one letter, he urges a local governor to send grain ships on time, writing gently, "The people do not live on promises, but on bread." In another, he reminds officials that hunger makes no distinction between rich and poor, and that a single delayed shipment could ignite an entire city. Though written in formal language, the letters reveal fatigue and pleading. Officials themselves suffered hunger. Villages asked for grain no longer had enough, even for their own. Famine became an administrative system. Everything was measured in grain, ships, storehouses, daily rations. Laws revolved around wheat. Those who smuggled it were punished. Bakers who lightened loaves were whipped. Those who hid grain were pursued as criminals. Yet behind these cold regulations were real lives. Mothers dividing the last crust among their children, farmers digging dry soil, guards trading grain secretly at night. Cassiodorus, who lived among kings and books, saw every order as a cry for help. He knew his words couldn't stop hunger, but they preserved its memory. Language became a mirror of famine. Letters became survival. The empire that once issued its orders in prosperity now wrote them on damp paper sent along deserted roads, arriving late as rain after ruined crops. Hunger became not just a crisis, but a way of life, a language spoken by kings, clerks, soldiers, and women in empty kitchens. Then illness came. From the silence of the ports came an enemy unseen, one that would change history. In 541, from the old ports of Egypt, a plague arrived with the ships that carried grain and goods to Constantinople. The city was crowded, markets full. No one noticed that death was hidden among the cargo. At first, strange cases appeared, people collapsing suddenly in the streets, fevers flaring at night, dark swellings on bodies. Then the count climbed at terrifying speed. In days, the great city fell into a thick silence, broken only by wagons. This was the Justinianic plague, named after Emperor Justinian I, who himself caught it. It spread from Constantinople to Asia Minor, Greece, Italy, North Africa, and Europe. Corpses were gathered in great carts and buried in trenches until space ran out. In villages, the dead were left in their homes out of fear. Trade halted. Ships stayed in port. No one dared carry goods. One historian claimed that in some days, Constantinople lost 100,000 people. Some say half its population vanished in weeks. In the West, news arrived late but spread terror. Rome, still recovering from siege, saw sickness among soldiers and merchants. Churches turned into shelters for the ill. In the countryside, farming stopped again. Farmers died before they could sow or harvest. The plague distinguished no rank or class. It returned in waves for nearly a century. Between waves, cities weakened, fields lay barren, and roads emptied. It was a new voice in Rome's long winter, silent but unforgettable. After the plague, the empire was never the same. People no longer trusted the promise of spring. The sea, too, became an enemy. In winter, storms closed ports, grounded ships, and left the empire powerless. Without compasses or reliable charts, sailors feared dark skies. A trip from Sicily to Ostia could take weeks instead of days. Some ships that left in autumn arrived only in spring, carried by currents to distant shores. With navigation halted, Rome's stores dwindled. Grain kept from summer barely lasted through winter. Delays meant rising prices and long queues. Loaves were stretched with barley, lentils, or even sawdust. Coastal towns lived in hope of a single arriving sail. People gathered each morning by the shore, scanning the horizon. If they spotted a white sail, prayers rose in every home. If not, silence returned. Sometimes ships sank within sight of port, watched helplessly from the walls as waves swallowed grain meant for thousands. On bitter nights, the river bringing shipments from Ostia froze partially, stopping boats. When it thawed by day, they moved slowly under heavy rain, carrying the last threads of life. Every small delay changed the city's entire day. Ovens closed, rumors spread, people hoarded flour. When bread reappeared, crowds surged as if it were gold. Thus the sea was friend and foe, granting life in calm, taking it in storms. Rome had once held 1 million souls, lit by torches, filled with fountains and crowded streets. But the sounds faded one by one, like candles dying in a great hall. After centuries of glory came sackings, famine, sieges, plague. Rome did not fall in one blow. It melted slowly like snow beneath a weak sun. By the mid-6th century, a traveler walking her streets saw more bones than people. Aqueducts dry, baths abandoned, theaters turned into shelters for birds, ovens cold. Labor had died in the plague. Money vanished in war. Temples closed, some becoming quiet chapels. The population fell to perhaps 30,000, living mostly along the Tiber where water and bread were slightly easier. Northern districts grew wild with plants. Wolves, they said, roamed at night near the city's edge. And yet life did not fully vanish. Church bells still rang. Small workshops made simple tools. Gardens were planted within the walls. Rainwater collected in old basins. Markets exchanged whatever goods remained. Rome changed from imperial capital to large village built upon ruins. It became less a place than a memory of an age. Each winter extinguished another of its ancient lanterns. Roman soldiers did not fear war, they feared winter. Camps of mud and wood were built far from cities, wagons piled up, storehouses sealed. Soldiers huddled around small fires, waiting for dawn like travelers waiting for a ship. The land turned to a sea of mud. Roads became rivers of filth. Nothing could move, neither armies nor supplies. Even the emperor's letters arrived late or not at all. In the east, fortresses like Dara and Nisibis held vast stores of grain, but reaching them in winter was nearly impossible. At the front, soldiers divided dry bread or handfuls of barley for horses. Nights were long and cold. Tents rattled under wind. Metal shrank from frost. Commanders wrote to the capital, "The roads are closed. The soldiers cannot move." There was no revolt, no defeat, only endless waiting. Even great generals like Belisarius paused their campaigns each winter, noting in their letters that spring alone opened the roads. Armies learned that war was not just battles, but endurance. To keep the fire burning, the horses standing, the supplies counted. Winter taught Rome that swords did not cut through cold. Rome's winter was not a single season, but an era. Centuries of cold in weather, in hearts, in cities that fell silent piece by piece. Since that distant night when the Rhine was crossed in 406, cracks spread through the empire. Each decade stole a little warmth. Rome lost Africa's grain, the sea's trade, the people who filled its streets. Then the great cold of the mid-6th century dimmed the sun itself. Fields withered, roads dried, armies camped in mud, waiting for a spring that never returned as before. Time itself seemed altered. Rome, once the empire's sun, sat quietly among ruins. The walls still stood, but behind them life was faint. The city was like an old man remembering his youth while no one else could. Each year people said the cold would pass, but it stayed, choosing to accompany the empire to its end. The last winter was not merely weather. It was a historic moment when cold, hunger, plague, and war gathered together and closed the door on an age. As warmth faded, a new world was born. Upon the ruins of the old empire, new peoples slowly built the Europe of the Middle Ages. But Rome's ancient warmth, the flame that once lit the world, was gone, extinguished by winter and forgetfulness. The empire did not shatter in one day. It melted like ice, silently. And as its last lantern was snuffed out, a new dawn rose, a dawn of another world built upon the ashes of a cold empire and the heat of a lesson never to be forgotten. Thus the winter lasted, so long that it seemed the image of an entire age,